My name is Josh Shorb. I'm the supervisor for Park County Weed and Pest Control District up in Powell. And we're in Jackson right now at our conference, and a lot of guys are retiring right now. We had our conference banquet last night. We said so long to 6 guys and gals. It's 194 years of experience walking out the door out of the institution of the weed and pest. My boss, Bob, accounted for 37 of those years, and it meant a lot to me. He took me under his wing, and he really showed me a lot of the ins and outs and shared a lot of the stories and why things are the way they are today and kind of where things came from the past. I think he cared a lot to share those stories with me and others as well, but it meant a lot for me personally to learn all this stuff, and it really connected me to the weed and pest. My job right now is more than a job, and it's more than a career. It's my passion. This is what I'm going to do. And that's why we need to preserve these memories.
Wyoming was still wild in 1895. In fact, the Johnson County War had taken place only 3 years prior. Now, a new war was being fought in the state and across the West. The U.S. Department of Agriculture had been instructed by Congress to investigate the issue. And although proposed federal funding failed in the Senate, Wyoming legislators took up the fight. On the last day of session, with overwhelming support, House Bill 174 became the first Wyoming law to provide for the destruction of a weed. That weed is what we now know as Russian thistle, commonly called the tumbleweed.
They first found it in Cheyenne on the railroad tracks, and they called in Avon Nelson, who happened to be University of Wyoming botanist at the time. And Avon identified it as Russian thistle. And Avon, who later on would become president of the University of Wyoming at one point and also created the Rocky Mountain Herbarium, at that time came out with a lot of press releases in the media about Russian thistle, how to identify it, why we needed to be concerned about it.
Russian thistle seed entered the United States as an infestation in a shipment of flaxseed from Russia. The flax was planted in South Dakota and soon spread into neighboring states via the railroad.
Wyoming cannot afford to delay in this matter. The pest is well established within our borders and will, in another season or two, be entirely beyond our control.
In 1896, Avon authored a publication that identified the worst weeds in Wyoming. Russian thistle was listed as the #1 weed threat in the state.
And in 1903, there was a gentleman out of Albany County who said, I think Russian thistle would be a great forage for livestock.
The repeal of the tumbleweed law had overwhelming support.
Russian thistle does not have forage value, or has a very minimum forage value, but through the Dust Bowl, a lot of the ranchers in the state actually survived because of Russian thistle.
I do not cherish the utopian dream that we shall ever be rid of weeds, but there are some that ought to receive the most earnest attention, not only on the part of individuals immediately concerned, but by the state as a whole.
In 1905, the horticulture law was passed, which protected fruit crops in Wyoming from insect pests. At that time, there were orchards located along several riparian watersheds.
The horticulture law created the state entomologist's job. And the state entomologist's job was housed in the University of Wyoming. But then in 1923, because we're having all the issues with insect pests, whether it was grasshoppers or Mormon crickets, and on the other side of things, we had a lot of issues with rodent pests, prairie dogs and field mice. 1923, legislature passed 2 laws. One was an insect pest control law. The other was a rodent control law. And both of those laws allowed counties to create districts.
Pests, both rodent and insect, had much to fear in Wyoming. But despite recommendations, noxious weeds were just not important enough to spend money on. As the Dust Bowl was overtaking the Midwest, grasshoppers and Mormon crickets were moving in.
Well, we couldn't raise too much as the grasshoppers were waiting right there to take every bit of garden. We didn't have any crops. The cattle had to live on Russian thistle. and the milk was so bitter we couldn't even use it. Those were really hard times.
Finally, in 1931, the insect and pest laws in Wyoming were recodified. The wording was changed to include noxious weeds.
In 1935, after several years of the Department of Agriculture was really pushing that the noxious weeds were becoming a bigger and bigger problem in the state, the legislature put $20,000 into the state budget specific to noxious weed control. And that was 1935. Obviously, that's in the Dust Bowl era, and there was not what you'd say a lot of money to throw around, and certainly 20,000 isn't much by our accounts now. But that's an important piece of timing right there, because in 1935 is when the first weed and pest districts were then really created with specific weeds in mind.
Now, in my minutes to go back into the 1938s, we had a weed district in Meeteetse, we had a weed district in Cody, we had a weed district in Powell. So we had weed districts all over the county, or at least 3 of them.
It depends on what source you go to, but there's documentation that the first weed and pest district in the state was in Park County, Wyoming. However, there are reports that Bighorn County would challenge them on that, and that they started their weed and pest district first.
The laws were very enforceable. I don't know how far back, but I've read in the minutes where they would go in and condemn a place and actually tell the farmer they could not harvest a crop. The weed and pest would take it over and actually plow that area and plow those patches or that field or whatever under continually.
Weed control well into the 50s was primitive, using a variety of methods in addition to clean cultivation. Other methods explored included burning, sterilization using salt, soil fumigation, and chemicals that were extremely hazardous to anyone or anything that came in contact with them. Weed control in those days was time-intensive, expensive, and not very effective.
It was mostly a law enforcement kind of thing. If somebody wasn't taking care of the weeds, you wrote them a ticket, and they went to court.
Through the 50s, you're talking 10 weed and pest districts out there, up to 16 weed and pest districts. So now we currently have 23 weed and pest districts based on each county, but so there was a very fragmented district program in the state up through the 50s.
That was a time when weed and pest districts were formed by so many percent that signed up, and you created lines and in the counties.
First off, those districts were very small, and they couldn't do anything about the guys outside the district.
It was very difficult to try and tell people that it was to their best interest to control weeds.
Alva Elledge was, up until a few years back, he's considered the father of Wyoming weed and pest districts.
Alva was one of those folks that he believed in weed and pest control, and he had as hard a time as anybody else talking about how do you get people interested in forming weed and pest districts.
The thing about Alva is that he saw that noxious weeds were going to reduce crops. They were going to spread to other places. We had a clean county. Let's keep it that way. And he was phenomenal in his efforts to put it together.
If you take a look at every area that back in the 60s that didn't have a weed district, you're talking about, or weed area, you're talking about ranching. Wide open, BLM, Forest Service, whatever.
It was perceived at that time as just an agriculture problem, which now I hope that people understand it's not only statewide, it's regional, and it's national.
They tried to take this law through the session in 1972, and it just got beat to death. I mean, it didn't get anywhere. And so to the Weed and Pest Council's credit, they reorganized and said, okay, this law makes sense. We need to sell it to the legislature. And so they did a heck of a job between 72 and 73 of just going out and talking to each legislator that was out there and say, this is why this is important.
We had a lot of support going. Former Governor Stan Hathaway was a staunch supporter of it. A lot of the ag organizations, we even had municipalities involved. The biggest obstacle we had in getting the 1973 law into effect was the Wyoming Department of Agriculture fought that bill tooth and nail.
Before, all the weed and pest laws in the state were basically giving them the option of creating a weed or pest district, whether they had grasshopper issues, whether they had Mormon cricket issues, whether they had weed issues. It was optional based on the landowners in that area. The 73 law said you're going to have a weed and pest district in each county and you're going to fund it.
I didn't have my own budget when I came here in 1974. And when I started out, I was allowed to travel 6 days a month. And then when the grasshopper season hit, those funds would be used up, and I was allowed 3 days a month. And then I was down to half a day a month.
The state of Wyoming said, no, we got to do this on a county boundary line. And even then, Teton County didn't have a weed supervisor or a functioning weed and pest district until '85.
In the beginning, you know, they just were looking for warm bodies. Anybody could kill a weed. That they've learned since that that's not the way it works, that you have to know what you're doing and know what pesticides to apply and how to apply them.
Yeah, we was still green, we was still trying to get going. There was no bylaws, no nothing. We didn't even actually have any buildings. We was working out of our own personal garages and homes and very little equipment.
And we had a number of districts where there was a board, but they had a summer guy as a seasonal employee as a supervisor. In the wintertime, they just all went home. You know, their vision of the program was, we're going to go out and spray the weeds on the county road. That's their vision of the program.
Some districts would go in and hire somebody on the pool hall to work the summer. We're out of a bar. We had this going on.
George had no bedside manner, but he got things done. He really did. He got a lot of things done. He was just George.
The man was a miracle worker, as far as I'm concerned. He was hard-headed enough that he knew what he wanted and he wasn't willing to accept no, and eventually he got what he wanted. And he built this organization.
Spent a lot of time with George. He was a good hand, and he knew what I needed to know, and he didn't mind telling me. Keep me lined out.
Harold Alley, he taught me agricultural chemicals. I couldn't even spell that when I was transferred out here. Yeah, Harold Alley was my mentor.
At the university we had Harold Alley, but he was great. Just one of them forefathers that brought things to Wyoming that made it work.
Fabulous weed scientist, did a lot of research. Tom Whitson followed him up and was likewise very, very instrumental and very effective in educating and helping the weed districts in the state of Wyoming.
And at that time, most people thought Wyoming was still wild. And in some places it still is.
I met Guy way back in the early days. Guy and I became pretty good friends. He worked for a chemical company then, sold products. And we kind of hit it off, and he loved Wyoming.
Yes, Roy Reichenbach. Yeah, Roy was they called him the judge. And he was quite a guy. He moved on from being weed and pest supervisor to be in Slade's position, you know, the weed and pest coordinator for the state.
38 years ago, there was not a woman supervisor in the state of Wyoming, and I don't believe there was a woman board member. This was a man-run organization.
I think it was Adrian Peterson. Yeah, Adrian was the first one, you know, and she took Split County and built a terrific program up there.
She was the first person that I really met in the weed and pest, and she's been that way to everyone.
She was a real go-getter.
I may be getting drifted off a little bit here, but we had a couple of brothers from the eastern side of the state over there. One from Laramie and one from Scotch Bluff. The McNamee brothers, Tom and Stan. They was both supervisors. They played musical instruments, banjo and guitar. We got together at this conference, weed and pest, spring workshop, summer seminars. Anytime we got together, it was a requirement for Tom and Stan to bring their instruments.
Well, it's going to be hard to replace some of those people like, you know, Lars and Bob Parsons and Dad and Tom and Bob Lee and Larry Justison and Steve Brill, and you know, the people like Larry and Steve, they learned from Dad and people like that, and so they still have those same values.
You know, we have such a great generation of young folks coming up through this program that I have met. It's going to get better. I mean, we did what we could do, you know, the best we could, hopefully. Made a lot of mistakes, but looking at this group that I have the last few years, there's some really, really good people going to take these programs over and do a lot better job than we did.
It's been a joy working with all of them. I've met some awesome people over the years and good friends, and I see the youth, the young people that are coming into it, have every bit as much enthusiasm, if not more, to carry it on. And I'm pretty proud of that. I'm proud to be in part of the Wyoming Weed and Pest Council, because I think across the country a lot of people look at this organization and are impressed with the way it's run, the resources, the direction, and the enthusiasm of everybody, and the determination to do good for the public.
Keep fighting weeds, because we gotta get our head above water. And good luck.